Hello believers, welcome to the podcast where we speak to creative people about what they do, how they think, and the most influential TV show of all time. I'm in what can only be described as limbo this episode. There's a bright light ahead and I'm slowly walking towards it. Still time to have a chat though before I meet whatever it is at the end of this tunnel. Hope your summers are going well. Did you enjoy Twisters? Did you enjoy Trap? Did you enjoy Alien Romulus? Did you do anything else aside from going to the cinema on a sunny day? I did, just about. Managed to get out and been lucky enough to see some really great shows at the Edinburgh Fringe. Natalie Palamides, Chloe Radcliffe, Rachel Kelly, Batshit at the Travis. 3 shows in a day is about my limit though. The brain can only handle so much stimulation before it switches off and you end up doing that kind of rictus grin thing at the performers. If you've got a show yourself and you're listening to this, hope it's going well. Don't read the reviews, or at least take any positives you can from them. Try to get out of the city centre if you have a day off. Get on the tram, come down to Leith. Remember, as one former podcast guest said, outside of the square mile of Edinburgh city centre, no one cares if you've got a 2.5-star review in fringybaby.com. Someone who knows all about the shadowy parts of Edinburgh, whether the fringe is on or not, is today's guest. It's the writer and paranormal psychologist, Evelyn Hollow. I'm sure you'll know Evelyn for being an expert on various TV shows and podcasts, most recently on BBC shows like the Battersea Poltergeist, The Witch Farm and Uncanny. She's also been seen on Warner Brothers TV show Spooked Scotland and Spooked Ireland, which she talks a little bit about on today's episode. Evelyn talks about her approach to the paranormal, Scotland and its folklore, if class plays any part in otherworldly sightings, navigating the strange world of reality TV, a new book, and of course, The X-Files Season 2, Episode 8, One Breath, in which Scully is found comatose in hospital after a abduction, leaving Mulder to investigate what has happened to her. Pleasure to speak to Evelyn. I'm a massive fan of her work, and I'm looking forward to reading her book when it comes out soon. As always, if you like the show, please do leave me a message, subscribe and review, follow us on X and Instagram and YouTube. It's probably time for me to turn back to the land of the living now. Can't be checking out yet. Got a podcast to do, for goodness sake. Anyway, here's Evelyn. Right.
I've got chronic insomnia and chronic in pain, so my sleep is abysmal.
Oh, right.
It's a bit worse than normal at the moment. I've got sort of health problems, but I've also trying to get re-registered, new doctors, and just, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Good luck.
Pretty tired at the moment, but just, yeah, other than that, okay, just cracking on with it. There's, starting to ramp up into being quite a bit busier because we've got a new Uncanny tour coming up, and
amazing.
My book's just gone to the printers, and there's loads of other stuff happening as well. So just started to come into sort of the busy season, which is good because I like to be busy. So yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, that must be terrible if you can't sleep. I presume you've been through every single type of remedy there might be out there. And is there anything that works or doesn't work?
Yeah, it's kind of brutal because so I've had chronic insomnia my entire life, kind of sleep problems run in my family. And yeah, I've tried herbal stuff, I've tried sleeping tablets, tea, I try to read before bed rather than being on my phone.
Yeah.
And just, I've just had it my entire life. And then I've also got constant pain in my back, my hips, my neck. And I don't know what it is, and I don't have any medication for it beyond paracetamol. So even when I feel physically tired and I can get my brain to shut off, my body's then in pain. So I turn the entire night. But I've honestly just kind of gotten used to it. I probably only sleep an average of 4 or 5 hours a night. But at the moment I'm sleeping 2. So I'm like a half shut knife at all times, to be honest.
Yeah. How does that affect you in the day then? Is it, do you I mean, is there anything you can do in the day to sort of make it better or not better, or do you find, you know, when you sit down to do anything, any work, you're kind of just unable to concentrate on it?
I think it's one of the annoying things is that I will often, if I'm on the couch doing something, reading or watching something, I tend to fall asleep, even if it's just for an hour, and then I get in. But when I go into bed at night, even if I'm shattered, if I've been up for 18, 19 hours, I can't sleep. But if I lie on the couch to check my emails for something, I will like doze off sort of for like 40 minutes, maybe an hour. So
Right.
it's annoying more than anything else.
Yeah, that sounds like a nightmare. The book sounds amazing, though. I mean, I've ascertained what the book's going to be about, but is there much you can say about the book at the minute?
Yeah, so the book has just gone to the printers, so pre-orders should be up soon in the next couple of months, and it comes out in September. It's being published on Ivy Press, who are owned by Quarto Publishing Group.
Right.
It's a hardback, and it will be published in the UK, America, and New Zealand, and I think Australia possibly simultaneously. And then we'll take it from there in terms of distribution. The book is the Atlas of Paranormal Places.
Oh, wow.
So it covers places all over the world, lots of different categories, everything from sort of like strange nature to witchcraft to hauntings. It's really varied, and it's got full colour photographs of locations, and we also had a cartographer hand draw maps for every single entry as well.
Wow.
So it's a good looking book. I'm excited to actually hold it in my hands finally at some point.
It's bringing to mind those old Usborne books. You know, I had a few of those when I was a kid, and they left such a kind of indelible mark on me and my interest in, you know, all things paranormal. So I can't wait to check that out. I imagine there's a massive section on Scotland, is there?
Well, yeah, I've covered, because it's worldwide, and we try to keep it as varied as possible, but obviously being Scottish and Scotland being one of the most, famously mythological and supernatural places in the world, I think there's at least 2 entries on Scotland, and I think I've got 2 for Ireland as well. I try to squeeze them in there, even though it's a worldwide book, but yeah, there's stuff on Scotland.
I know you talked in the past about Scotland being a particularly haunted place. It'd just be good to hear you talk about that and why you think that is.
Well, there's a variety of reasons. So firstly, that Scotland is an incredibly old country, truly old place, and her history is really complicated. She's seen everything from, before she was Scotland, it was run by individual clans. So there's such a variety of people, belief systems, cultures, traditions, languages, and then that's all melted down. And then when she was known as sort of Scotland, which was a name given to us by the Romans, Scotty is actually a slur. It basically meant barbarian.
Right.
And that's how it became Scottyland, and that's how we know it is Scotland. And from there, she's got such a violent history, of genocide, ethnic cleansing, wars, but also there's lots of mythology. We had, obviously, very famously, the witch trials that happened in Scotland were some of the worst that happened anywhere in the world. You also had persecutions of faith, so even Protestants versus Catholicism, Covenanters. The world's first concentration camp was in Scotland, and it wasn't by the Nazis for the Jews. It was the English crown wanting people in Scotland to bend the knee, and when they refused to worship their faith in the way that the crown wanted to, they were rounded up and imprisoned in Covenanters. I think there was more than almost 1,000 of them, most of which starved to death. Some were executed, some were put on ships and sold as slaves to the colonies, most of them drowned off the coast of Orkney. But yeah, she's had an incredibly turbulent and violent past, but there's also a big complex set of belief systems and languages and culture and mythology. And I also think oral storytelling is a huge part of our culture here. So a lot of the sort of legends and mythology have endured.
But when I moved up here, to Edinburgh, I was really impressed by, how much of a storytelling scene there is here. I never known anything like it. I'm glad to see it's still thriving. Is Scotland still, I'm gravitating towards haunted place, but of all the places you've looked at, is Scotland, still a place where more people will come across paranormal activity than anywhere else?
It's definitely up there. Edinburgh alone in particular is known as the City of Ghosts, and she's been known as that for at least 100 years, because per capita she's got the most number of ghost stories, but even if you go up to the Highlands, I mean, the Highlands is incredibly rich with not just ghost stories, but folklore. And a lot of those beliefs are still actively practiced. Leaving out small offerings for the Brunies, not stepping on certain places, fairy mounds, fairy hills, standing stones, lots of everyday traditions on how you do things, on farms, on crofts, but so right the way from the most rural places, like fishing villages and little crofts and farms in the middle of nowhere, but right the way up to the most densely populated cities like Glasgow and Edinburgh, you've still got all of these ghost stories happening that range right the way from poltergeist activity to, sort of strange and uncomfortable things, people being injured. It's really dense, and I know that Edinburgh sort of capitalises on it, one of the kind of great true Gothic cities, but you honestly find it everywhere in Scotland. You can probably ask just about anybody, and either they have a ghost story, something's happened to them, or someone in their family, or someone they know. Everybody has one.
Yeah, I'm fascinated to hear you talk about your studies into consciousness, and what happens when in a person's mind when they think, in your words, endorse a paranormal belief. Is there a particular section of society that, and I'm not casting any aspersions, I feel like, I'm from a working class background myself, and maybe there's something in, like you mentioned, the kind of oral storytelling tradition in Scotland, but, from what you've seen, is there a particular member of society or part of society that's specifically susceptible to experiencing the paranormal?
It's a difficult thing to measure, because in psychology, when we're using psychometrics, so methods of assessment, maybe to ask people if they've ever experienced a paranormal event, or if they even endorse paranormal belief, like they might not have personally had an experience, but they believe that it's possible that, say, ghosts exist, that sort of thing. It's very difficult to measure because people are really cagey about this sort of thing. So especially older generations, you would not have wanted to mention it because you don't want to be branded as mentally ill, or less intelligent or gullible or things like that. So these people just did not talk about it, and you'd be surprised at how many people have contacted either sort of us through Uncanny or other shows, or even just myself, and say, I've never told anyone this before. And they're usually from an older generation, and they've held on to these experiences their entire life and never said anything. And the same in working class communities as well, because you try to imagine having a job at a factory or a mill, and then you say, you're seeing something, you're risking your job essentially, or you're risking being extradited or persona non grata from your community, and people talk, you end up with a reputation. So I think a lot of people are inclined to think that certain backgrounds are more likely to endorse paranormal belief, but it's actually less so. And then the same way with, if you look at like wealthy upper class people, they'll have experiences, but they'll also be less inclined to tell you, and things like that. There's the sort of thing that's just not talked about. So it's really difficult to get an accurate picture. And I did this for part of my bachelor's degree. I designed psychometrics and experiments looking at what the possible confounding variables were for endorsing paranormal beliefs. So we looked at everything from like religious belief, gender, age, nationality, ethnicity, all the the big sort of categorizable sects, and to see what it was. And there might be people that potentially are more susceptible from it, but it's also just really difficult because it's so difficult to get people to talk about this stuff. So I don't think we have a remotely accurate picture of it. And
I'm also fascinated by what if there's a normal day in the life of a paranormal psychologist, and is there, or
no? No.
How are you approaching things? And is it like a day by day basis where let's say you're working on Uncanny, or or you're working on some studies, or you're working on a book? Is there a different routine for all that, or are you very much, you get up, you have a coffee, if you've had some sleep, great, if not, you just dive into work, or is there a different process involved?
So every day is completely different for me, which I suppose is a good thing. I've got the least dull job in the world. But yeah, every day is completely different for me. Depends what I'm doing. I could be doing radio recordings or podcast recordings, so that could be Uncanny or other shows, or I could be doing guest interviews like I'm doing now, and they can be sort of any time from early in the morning, they can be right the way through to in the evening, depending on sort of time zones and things. So it's like sort of prepping notes and going through emails, researching anything for cases, any information, and then recording when I'm writing books. So I've just finished one, but about to potentially start another one, and I don't have a set routine at all, and part of that is because my sleep is so broken. But I was also a shift worker for like 10 years, so I have no sense of routine whatsoever. Sometimes I'm up from 10 in the morning, sometimes I don't get up until noon, sometimes I finish work at 5, 6, 7 p.m. Sometimes I work right the way through until midnight. It totally depends what I'm doing. And then if I'm on the road a lot for touring, so we've got like Uncanny live shows and appearing at conferences and festivals and things like that, then it's a lot of prepping and reading emails and researching cases and things, and then turning up and getting sound checked and performing and doing things. There's a little bit more structure, I think, when you're on the road touring, because you have to check out at a set time every morning in a hotel, and then travel all day, sound check, then I'll go and get ready, or get ready, down sound check, then quickly try to wolf something down, get a post on social media, do the performance, sign autographs until about 11 p.m, sometimes closer to midnight, and then get back to the hotel.
Wow.
So every single day is totally different, which is good, because I think I would be really bored if I had a set routine. I don't cope with that at all. The ADHD is a hard no to routine. So
What was the shift work you were doing?
So originally I started. So I think my first shift work job, I worked in like a private sort of medical and psychiatric unit,
right?
For a couple of years whilst I was doing my undergrad, and then once I started my masters, I went to work in hospitality. So I worked in a bar for 6-7-ish years, I think, and I was a manager there for a long time, and then I left once I had so much on my plate that I couldn't I didn't need the job anymore. I couldn't keep doing it. But yeah, a lifetime. My entire adult lifetime was spent doing shift work, and I think that's destroyed. If I did have any sort of circadian rhythm beforehand, which I didn't, because I had sleep problems before that anyway. But yeah, it's obliterated now. It's never coming back. So. Because
I know you wanted to get into forensic psychology initially, or you were studying that. What did your family think, and what did your mum think, and were they always supportive of what you were doing? And was there any point when you turn around and said, actually, this is what I'm going to devote my life to now? Is there any kind of pushback at any of that, or were they very supportive?
Well, my parents aren't really that involved. Well, my dad's dead now, but but both of them, to be honest, they weren't really that involved. So originally I applied for university just when I finished high school, when I was in my last year, and I think I actually applied to do like literature or writing or whatever, and I didn't get in because the high school I went to was a mess, and they'd lost like prelim results and stuff and exams, and so the marks that I did get back, I didn't have enough to get. It was just an absolute mess.
Right. Is that West Lothian area you were? Right.
Yeah. So it's the school I went to is gone now. They demolished it, and then they rebuilt a new one of the same name further up. So the one that's there now is not the one I went to. It's a bit nicer. Right. But yeah, so I didn't get in originally. So then I worked for a year. I worked in a pharmacy for a year, and I did lots of writing and just reading and sorting stuff out. I had quite a successful writing blog at the time. And then I decided that I would do psychology instead. So I applied to Queen Margaret and I got in. And I managed to sort that out. And then, so I mean, originally my dad was not happy because his first thing was, well, how are you going to pay for that? So obviously your first degree in Scotland is covered by the government, which is good. But obviously, I didn't live in Edinburgh, I lived in Livingston, and Queen Margaret is in Musselburgh. So that's like on that's like, it's 2 hours away from Livingston. So my dad was like, how are you going to get there? Where are you going to live? Like, we don't have any money, so like I can't give you anything. I looked at getting like a bursary or support, but they wouldn't give me it. So I went to live with my grandparents who lived in Kerstorf, and my grandma said I could live in their front room because otherwise I literally couldn't afford to go to university. I had no way of going. So I was, that kind of saved my life. So I did that, and originally I wanted to do forensic psychology, so I kind of focused on that with a kind of subspeciality in like interactions between sort of consciousness and quantum physics. And then I worked as an experimental forensic psychology research assistant. And then in my 4th year, I found out that one of my supervising professors had a PhD in parapsychology. Yeah. And of course I was like, what the hell is that? And then I decided to swap my speciality. But yeah, I don't think my parents really cared either way. My father was just mostly like, when are you going to make money? That was his, he dropped out of high school when he was really young. And so in his head, education was kind of pointless unless you were doing it to get like a really good job. And then I went to do the masters, but there wasn't any, there's problems with funding for it and stuff like that. So I had to go to my grandparents and be like, even though I've graduated like top 5% of my university for my course, I can't do anything because I can't afford to do the masters. So we had to kind of sort that out, and then I eventually got it sorted, and I got in and was able to do my masters and masters of research, and I was able to specialize still in parapsychology because I had a professor who was qualified that could assess me and things like that for exams and my dissertation. But yeah, I mean, they didn't really care, to be honest. I worked in the bar, and every single time I went home, even by the time I was like, we'd done the Battersea Poltergeist and I was on the telly, I was appearing on This Morning, and Battersea Poltergeist had gone viral and it was huge, and my writing was reasonably successful. Every single time I went home, my dad would just say, like, when are you going to leave the stupid bar? Even though the bar is the hardest job I have ever had.
Right.
And most people literally would not survive a single shift in a busy pub and restaurant in Edinburgh. You wouldn't believe the hellscape. It takes a special level of like pain endurance to be able to work in hospitality long term. And the conditions are awful, like horrendous, and the pay is terrible, and it takes a special type of person to make it in hospitality. And my parents just saw it as a shitty job, so they were like, when are you going to leave? So I don't think it really mattered how successful I was in my dad's eyes. If I wasn't making lots of money, I wasn't successful. But yeah, I mean, I'm successful now, but he's also dead, so... I don't know if it really matters, to be honest.
Yeah, I have that. My dad passed away about 20 years ago now, and then it in no way was, a similar situation to your dad, but, there's part of me where I just think, we should be able to, just see, or at least have a conversation, or, just... not be able to tell him I told him so, because do you know what I mean? It was like, why are you going to study? Because I hadn't studied journalism, so he knew what a newspaper was. Something there, but it was like there was a certain amount of like, he'd grown up in a mining sort of colliery background, and they didn't get it, and then I did that classic thing of moving to London. And it makes me laugh now. Someone had done a supercut on the internet the other day of everybody in Coronation Street saying, "You're going where? London? You're going to London?" Like it's another side. So that's funny you say that. Musselburgh is, because I'm based in Edinburgh. I go there a lot, and it doesn't seem in my mind that far. But I suppose if your world is Livingston, and you don't. Well, that's what my mum's like, actually. She only got on the plane for the first time last year to go to Malta, and she only went to Malta because she'd seen it on an episode of Wish You Were Here about 20 years ago. So I was like, what's it like, Bob? And she's like, oh, it's sort of, have you seen Syria on the news? And I was like, in what, a war zone? No, it's not. What are you talking about? It's like, you've never been to Syria, and I don't know why. I think she just meant it was rocky and not many trees. So.
Yeah, it was like stony, like desert. Yeah. Malta's like Syria.
Yeah, so I'm glad I avoided that family holiday, to be honest with you. Is there something that, you mentioned questions that people ask you a lot. Is there something you get a lot when people are coming up to you at conventions, and is there anything that frustrates you in how people approach what you do?
I would say the two questions I probably get asked the most are, one, how do you become a parapsychologist? Because it's one of the absolutely most niche careers, and it's very difficult to get into because there's a limited number of parapsychologists, and then a limited number of them work actively at universities, teaching, lecturing, and so it's difficult to get onto courses and things like that. Edinburgh has a whole unit, a whole building, the Costler Parapsychology Unit, dedicated to do it, which is great. And there are more things popping up, but it's a very niche and difficult career to get into. So I completely understand people asking me about that. And the other thing I think I get always asked the most is, have I had any experiences? And I always say, well, I think I've talked about one or two of them on previous podcasts. I have lots of other things, but I don't talk about them, and I always say that I think that makes me a massive hypocrite. But the reason I don't is because, I think some things I'm also still trying to work out myself.
Yes.
Which is fine. But also, like, working in the field of science as a woman is dreadful. And doing that in a field that is looked down upon by other people and sciences and things like that is harder. And then, so when I come onto a show and if I start giving my professional opinions as a qualified psychologist, and I give my opinions, people listen to me, but then if I tell them I've had experiences, they tend to discredit it. They sort of glaze over and think, oh, well, you're only endorsing this because you've had an experience you can't explain.
Yes.
Like, they kind of forget that I'm a scientist, and then they just start listening to me as a pagan or as Evelyn. And so it's very difficult. So I'm very careful about, and I know that's so hypocritical, but I think I've talked about one or two just because they were so strange that it honestly, I have no explanation. I don't think anyone has any explanation for them.
Yeah, did you talk about the bird eater lady?
The bird eater incident, and things like that. They're so bizarre. I have no idea what happened. But there are lots of other things that I just don't talk about them because I just think people they'll just tune out. They'll just be like, I'm sometimes spoken to, like, when I do things and there's like 3 or 4 of us on something, as professionals, so it's usually like 4 of us as either historians or psychologists or experts of some, or professionals of some account, and things like that. Sometimes because I tend to be the more open-minded one, they often ask me questions as if I'm not a scientist. They're like, oh, here's X to give you the scientific explanation, and here's Evelyn to give you the non-scientific explanation. I'm like, that's not what that is. Like, I am a fully qualified scientist. And that's so that can be a bit frustrating. And it's just, like I everything that you hear from a skeptic, I can also tell you because we're both doing the exact same job. We're both the same qualifications. We've done the same training, worked in the same field, likely read and or written the same papers. And I can tell you, I can give you all their explanations, pareidolia, we can talk about priming effects, we can talk about hypnagogic states, whatever. But I'm not, because that's not my job. They're going to tell you that, and then I'm going to tell you, okay, well, if it's not that, here's some other stuff it could be, here's some context, here's some history, there's other things. And that's my job, but people forget that is my job. Like, that is what I'm paid to do. I'm paid to give you if it's not what this person says, Evelyn, what could it be? And then that is my job to give you that. But they just think, oh, well, Evelyn just says it's ghosts every time. And I'm like, no, I'm asked, if it's not something else, then could it be ghosts? And if so, how could it be that? And like, are there other cases? That is quite literally my job.
I've heard you say that you don't like being called a ghost hunter, and I sort of likened that to I've got a big interest in meteorology and storm chasing, and there's obviously a massive difference between someone who goes out as an enthusiast being a storm chaser and calls herself a storm chaser, and someone who's a qualified meteorologist. Do you think people running around on YouTube shows, do you think that's damaging for your line of work, or do you think it opens up more of an interest to more people about what you do?
So I think the comparison with storm chaser and meteorologist is a really good example, because so for me, people, it's just sometimes it's always the papers, and you'll do an interview and sometimes they'll put, oh, parapsychologist Evelyn Hollow, and sometimes they'll put famed Scottish ghost hunter, and I'm like, I have never I have a master's. I have never been a ghost hunter. I have worked on 2 shows where I have had to do sort of ghost hunting, but basically I'm part of a team and I have been asked to appear there as a parapsychologist to give like information and context and history and things like that, and that's fine. But I am not a ghost hunter. I don't, please don't, I never want to wear another head torch again. Like, there's a reason I've done 2 shows, and then anytime I've been offered a show that even remotely feels like ghost hunting, I've said no to it.
Yes.
But I think, so for me, I think there's 2 sides of that. Yeah, the sort of YouTube, usually like very American kind of schlocky ghost hunting. The upside is that, yeah, I'm glad that people are really interested in these places, sometimes abandoned places, because then it can sometimes drive tourism, which can help get them restored and looked after and things like that. I also think it's good that people are really interested in the history of their area, history of their country, even if it's like mythology or, kind of religious beliefs. I think all of that is great. But also at the same time, you have 4 or 5, sometimes more unqualified people running around in head torches with devices that measure, we don't know really what, or they're just measuring electrical frequency, but what does that have to do with anything? And or there's now people inventing and making their own ghost hunting equipment, which is cool. It's really interesting. But is it measuring, like, as a scientist, to me, the first thing we do is, are we measuring what we say we're measuring? So if I have a device in my hand and it's lighting up, what is it measuring? And then we go, okay, well, it's measuring, electrical frequency. Okay, well, what does electrical frequency mean? Like, how is that connected to the paranormal? But they're not. They're running around, and whenever a bit of equipment goes off or something happens or they hear a noise, they're all screaming and freaking out. And the Americans in particular come from a predominantly Christian background, so whenever something happens, they're like, oh, it's demons or it's angels, because that's their conditioning. That's what they would assign it to, whereas people in, say, India would have a different belief. People in Indonesia would have a different belief. People in Egypt would have a different belief. And so we have to look at it like sociologically through that lens of how they're interpreting the data that they're getting. But it's also just sometimes just, really... it's really chaotic. It's very rarely scientific, and also sometimes it can be quite dangerous because people are breaking into places that are really decrepit, and you don't want anyone to get injured, fall through some floorboards or cut themselves and need to get a tetanus shot. And then also it can encourage other people to break into these places and they end up damaging historic buildings. And so I think excuse me, I think there is 2 sides to it. I'm glad that people are interested in this stuff, and I'm glad that they're researching things, but also, it's just like Kieran O'Keefe and I always say there's a huge issue with ethics in the paranormal, and both of us are really passionate about making sure that people are doing things in the correct way and not encouraging people to like break into buildings or to tell someone that they're demonically possessed and anything like that, because it's so dangerous.
Yeah,
so dangerous.
I guess a lot of those YouTube, programs should come with a disclaimer beforehand. Like, I can't remember the name, like Made in Chelsea, augmented reality. There's an augmented reality. It said this is for entertainment purposes, and you're watching that, and you're obviously watching it, waiting for something to happen. You're willing it, and there's probably an element of that. But I'd not actually seen any of Spooked Scotland the other day, and then there was some clips from that doing the rounds on TikTok. I'm too long.
No, I saw
did
it.
You see?
I was So we did 2 shows. We did Spooked Scotland and Spooked Ireland. I have only ever seen the first 2 episodes of Spooked Scotland. I've never seen the rest of it, and I've never seen any of Spooked Ireland. So Zach and I often get into bed at night and sometimes we watch TikTok for like half an hour before we go to sleep. We just watch trash, basically. We watch people make things and things like that. And it popped up and I was like, oh, for fuck's sake. And it had like, so it's gone viral for all the wrong reasons. Luckily, I am not in any of the clips. There's one clip where you can hear my voice in the background at the end, but it's not me. It's nothing to do with me. I was just the poor parapsychologist that got... That's the thing with these shows is you do not know like what is going to happen. So you make a show and you go to all these beautiful locations and the crew are amazing and really good fun to work with and stuff. And you go to these locations, but I did not know I was going to be ghost hunting.
Right.
I did not know that's what we were going to be doing, and I did not know that we were going to have a medium. That was all very last minute. I'd already signed the contract. So, I mean, it's interesting. We got to go to all these amazing locations, and certainly there were times where really interesting things happened. But I don't know, because I've only seen 2 episodes, and we film sometimes we're filming 10 hours worth of content, and obviously the episode is probably 45 minutes long.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff that's cut. But there's a lot of times where I would, go into stuff and something would happen, and then, so say maybe Ryan and I would go, okay, let's rule out what it is. So we know it's not this, let's check the batteries and stuff. We will go, because science is top down, so you're trying to rule out things. So we'll do that, we'll go through things, we'll rule obvious stuff out, like equipment malfunction and things. And then I can check for other things, and then we can discuss, okay, what do we think it's not, and let's whittle it down. But that's boring for a TV show, so all of that's going to get cut.
Right.
So the only thing you're going to see is people running around screaming or whatever. I don't know, I watched 2 episodes and was like, I'm never watching this again.
Yeah.
So,
That's fair.
I watched 2 and I was mortally embarrassed, and I have never watched any more of
Yeah,
it. So
that's totally correct.
and after that I was like, I'm not, lots of people have approached me for TV shows, and every single pitch I've taken, the first thing I say is, if this is ghost hunting, we're not doing it. Hard no. I was like, I'm in factual programming. That is what I do. I make factual programming now. So history, absolutely. Even a little bit of investigative stuff, that's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
But ghost hunting, hard no.
Yeah,
So,
totally fair.
yeah. So I'm avoiding TikTok at the moment.
Yeah, that's you do well too. Before we get on to X-Files, I was just going to ask you about your kind of love of horror and horror media, and where that come about, and is that something that's happened in tandem to your interest in the paranormal, or is it one thing that, did you see Texas Chainsaw, or did you see The Exorcist at a young age, and has that sparked off an interest there?
Yeah, so I don't remember this, but my father would tell you that the first film I ever watched was when I was 3, and it was Alien.
No!
It was Alien.
Amazing.
So I don't, obviously I was 3, so I don't actively remember it, but I know he's telling the truth, because what I do remember is when I was a little, really a little girl, before primary school age, so probably 5 or younger, my parents, my dad in particular, had this thing where they would say to me, what was it? It's like, what goes up the chimney or what goes down the chimney, and I would say Santa Claus. And then they would say, what goes down the hatch, and I would have to say lager. And then they would say, what does the alien say? And I would go, and I would hiss. And I did that all the time when I was a kid. So I know he's telling the truth. That was from when I was really, really young. That's one of my earliest memories.
Superb.
So yeah, I got into horror when I was super young. My mum used to work night shift at Sky, and we would have to stay up because we would then be driving from our house to a caravan park, which we sort of part lived on. And so we would have to stay up really late. She got home at 11:30, maybe midnight. And so what's on really late at night is things like The X-Files, but also things like Salem's Lot. What else? Even classic stuff like Nosferatu. So yeah, all this sort of horror stuff and alien stuff and Sleepwalkers and whatever are all these sort of classic horrors in particular are on late at night. So that's kind of how I got into that. And also video games. My dad was a big gamer, and the first 2, I grew up with a few things, but the main 2 games I grew up with were Silent Hill and Resident Evil.
Fantastic.
From when I was really small.
Yeah.
So a Saturday night was Jimmy, my dad's friend, would come round and we would play Silent Hill or Resident Evil on the PlayStation 1 or the very early PlayStation 2.
Yeah.
And I would sit and watch my dad play, and I would help him, I would write down puzzles and things like that.
Amazing.
And they are hugely influential, especially Silent Hill was massively influential on lots of stuff. My taste in horror, my kind of love for psychological horror, even the soundtracks, the atmosphere, all the kind of bizarre themes, and kind of subtle stuff in horror, rather than just outright gore. I'm not really into, I hate torture porn, apart from maybe the first Saw film, which is iconic. And I'm not big on gore. Body horror is great if it's practical effects. I think the greatest horror film ever made is John Carpenter's The Thing.
Amazing. Yep.
So yeah, it's definitely influenced me. It's also why I have no fear. People always ask that, that you're like, when you go to locations or when you're filming or recording, don't you ever get afraid? I'm like, no, not once. Like because I've grown up, I'm so desensitized to it because I've grown up literally as like a little girl, like 5 or 6 years old, probably like playing Silent Hill. So no, I do not experience fear.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for passive gaming and, being a sort of co-pilot. Because I used to do that as well. I'd go around with friends. And we used to play Resident Evil. And I'd just, hours I'd just sit and watch him. And I never said, can I ever go? I was like quite content to watch him avoid a giant spider or, get his head bitten off. So that's great. That's great to hear. Did you grow up watching the X-Files then? Did you watch that the first time round?
Yeah, absolutely. So X-Files started in 93, which is the same year I was born. So it wasn't, I was too young when it just came out. But I think by the time, I would have been really small, so probably maybe even like 5. It started airing and it was on late at night, so I'd watch it mostly with my dad because my mum was at work. But yeah, it was a huge influence on me when I was younger. I think Fox Mulder was probably my first crush. Dana Scully was also probably one of my early crushes. It had a massive influence on me. My mum had a really interesting experience because when she was working at Sky and the episode with the bugs, which I think is maybe season 1, maybe season 2, aired, and there's the sort of like trick that they do where it looks like a cockroach or something is crawling across your TV screen. Yes. It's really famous. So my mum was working at Sky that night and I have a really core memory of her coming home and saying that the phones were ringing the entire night because people kept calling up because they thought that bugs were coming out of their like telly and like Skybox and stuff. Like people thought they were real. And so my mum had to deal with the chaos of that working at Sky. And that's like one of my earliest memories.
That's so good because that's like you hear stuff about. I hear these stories about ghost people first time when they watch Ghost Watch when that was on and ringing in and people thinking that was real, and you take it with a pinch of salt. So that's nice. It's nice to hear people are so sucked in by a program that they think that's it's actually happening. Fantastic. Yeah. So this one we're going to talk about. This is season 2, episode 8, One Breath. And essentially, Scully's has she been abducted by aliens? We don't know. But the episode starts with a voiceover from Scully's mum. And it starts quite unlike a lot of X-Files episodes. You don't get someone running in the woods. There's no torchlights. It's quite ethereal. And we're sort of, are we inside Scully's head? We don't know. We're told this story about Scully when she was younger and her brothers shooting this grass snake with a BB gun, and how Scully was upset about it when she was a young girl, and then that flashback pulls back to reveal Scully chatting to Mulder, and someone brings in a tombstone with Scully's name written on it. So we know the characters are preparing for the worst. And then we get the credits. What did you think? Did you remember this episode, and what did you think about it? Going back to it for the first time in a while.
So I think when I first looked at the synopsis for it, I know that Scully gets abducted a few times throughout the X-Files, so I kind of remembered one of the abductions from later on, but I couldn't remember this specific episode. So I went back and watched it, and then I did sort of remember bits of it as we were going. It's quite a hard intro episode. Yeah. Because you come into it and you're kind of thrown right in it. What the hell is going on? And so, Scully is missing, and then she turns up at the hospital, but there's no information on how she got there. There's, they get away with a lot with saying she turned up, but she was there when the night nurses started, basically. Yeah. But then they have no idea who tended her. But she's hooked up to like an EKG machine and loads of other stuff and breathing apparatus, and they've no idea who set it up or how she got there. Like nobody saw them carrying in a body and hooking it up to a machine. And like I get there not being like paperwork or whatever, people could sneak in and stuff, but no one saw like doctors or people they've never seen before spending an hour hooking a lady up to 40 pieces of equipment. But and then obviously Mulder kind of freaks out and then tries to work out, who took her and what's going on with her. And then you get the lone gunmen
Yes.
arrive, who are great. They have their spin-off show is really good as well.
Do you know, I've not seen that, and I keep meaning to get back to it because like yourself, I'm quite fond of them, and particular Fro Hickey, who turns up in a full tux and some flowers for Scully. That really makes me laugh, given that she's given him all that. Previous to this, she just basically rolled her eyes at him for being a creepy little guy. So that's pretty good.
Yeah, I love his intro. Yeah, when he comes in, and then so they help Mulder. And then they say that her DNA has basically been altered or extended.
Yes.
But whoever's been experimenting on her is done, because this is like junk DNA, but it's destroyed her immune system. So I think the point of this episode is that Mulder kind of goes off the deep end and thinks she's going to die, so he just kind of wants revenge. And then he's kind of warned that, with Cigarette Smoking Man, it says that he's becoming a player in the game. So Mulder is being forced to become him, essentially. He's getting further into the game. He's going to kill people or be an accessory to people getting murdered. He's going to be taking revenge. He's going to have to compromise whatever his morals are in order to get closer to the truth. And the thing that sort of saves him is he has a decision. He can sit in his apartment and wait and execute the guys that are sent to raid his apartment by Deep Throat 2, or he can go and be with Scully, and then he does, and then Scully wakes up. So I think, it's a pretty on-the-nose episode, but I think the point is that it also challenges Mulder's faith. Obviously, he keeps Scully's cross necklace.
Yes.
And she says that she had Mulder's beliefs, and Mulder visually had her beliefs as well. So I think it's about an exchange between Dana being Christian and a scientist, and Mulder believing in, aliens and paranormal activity and things like that.
Yeah.
And how their beliefs influence them, but also that they need each other, because otherwise Mulder will go off the deep end. He'll go dark. Firstly,
it's a really wild performance from David Duchovny in this. He, like you say, really goes off the deep end. It's fantastic. I've up until this point not seen him shouting as much, and tearing about, breaking into Cigarette Smoking Man, who's called the Cancer Man briefly in this, by Mulder and Skinner. Skinner acting as a kind of. He has a good line. He reveals a bit about when he was in Vietnam. So you get this kind of adopted father figure from Skinner, who, is he an antagonist, or is he actually on the side of Mulder or not? And, like you say, Mulder's becoming a player in this. And I guess the other thing with the X-Files is, why don't they just kill Mulder and Scully? I guess because there'd be no show. But there's an element of this in... with the Smoking Man / Cancer Man, who obviously sees a bit of Mulder in himself. But no, I think you're totally right. It's the whole episode seems to be about faith, and Mulder believes everything he wants to believe, aliens and ghosts and all manner of paranormal activity. But, confronted by the faith of religion, he's a little less sure of himself at that. I quite liked, actually, the introduction of Scully's sister as well, because she's, Mulder's approaches it quite sceptically when he turns up to the hospital, and Melissa, Scully's sister's name, is there with a crystal, and she's doing some healing. But I don't think the show itself doesn't seem judgmental on that, and sort of accepts that on sort of face value. But I guess another thing I want to just briefly mention about is the depiction of Scully's visions when she's, where is she? She's in a kind of limbo, and she's on this boat, sort of becoming further and further from the shore and her family. And that, like you say, that seemed to me quite on the nose in terms of a vision that somebody'd have after, as they're approaching the end of their life or not. But have you noticed that in your travels and your research? Is that an overriding sort of theme that people tend to have when they're in between, life and death? Is it because you hear about that a lot? People looking for the light, or they just can't quite get to where they need to get to. But does that ring any bells for you?
Yeah, I think like end of life studies or coma studies are all really interesting. I think I did a paper on this during my undergrad, and I know that the KPU unit in Edinburgh works very closely with looking at kind of neurological imaging of people who are in comas and things like that to kind of test, out of body experiences and kind of afterlife experiences. There's lots of really interesting research on this. And I think the common things that come back is that people would report, seeing relatives or friends or family that have that are already dead,
Yeah.
and they sort of see them at the end of their bed or they hear them calling to them. Some people report, an incredible brightness or an incredible darkness. That's likely, chemical alterations in the brain, and other people would have out-of-body experiences, so they would see themselves standing in the room or from, I guess, what we would call camera angel, which is this sort of omnipotent position where you seem to just be looking down on the entire room, as if you were a being or God or whatever, from this strange angle where you can see everything. And there was a really interesting study done in this where they went to the rooms, the hospital rooms or the care rooms of people who were in a comatose state, and placed small objects on the top of wardrobes. Now the wardrobes are super tall. You can't see anything at all on the top of them from the ground. And they would place a small object on the top of it. And then when people woke up from comas, if they reported having an out-of-body experience, they would ask them what was on the top of the wardrobe, and some people were able to report what it was.
Wow.
It's a really interesting study. I found it when I was doing my undergrad. And yeah, so I think there are common things that come back and forth. There's been a lot of people who've been really, really seriously ill and come quite close to dying. And there's also people who have been at the verge of, mental health crisis. When we were doing the Uncanny tour, I think we were in Brighton, and a lady told us about the fact that, she'd been driven to the point of wanting to commit suicide. And when she was ready to do it, she actually saw herself, but many decades later, like an older version of herself, like how she was now. Who basically approached her and was like don't do it, basically. And there was some other stuff that happened, and that stopped her from committing suicide. So yeah, no, people have had all kinds of strange experiences.
Wow. Really fascinating, yeah. They approach it well, actually, in this episode in showing that. And I know I said it was a bit slightly hack, but it is a little bit hack.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very. Zach and I were laughing about that today. We were like, it's so aggressively 90s, like when they've got her on the boat with the tethered cord is a bit on the nose. But my favourite is actually when she comes back into her own body and there's like the kind of cheap green, well, at the time it probably wasn't cheap, but like green screen of her lying on the bed in the forest, and then it like melts back into the room. And Zach was just like, they probably were high-fiving themselves in the writer's room that day, like how good a job they done. But you forget how old it is. Like, that's going to be like season 2 must be like 1994 or something. So
yeah, that's right. It's a while ago, but I always like the fact that it picks up on. It tries to use the most up to date technology it can, and for budget reasons, sometimes it can. That's better than others. But yeah, that green screen's fairly wild at the end there.
Yeah.
I think an interesting episode, and I think one that the fans have embraced. Just looking back to it, I know Chris Carter was. I thought it was quite an interesting one when he was revisiting it recently. Is there anything else, firstly, that you wanted to say about this episode? And secondly, have you seen anything you've liked recently in terms of art and culture and books and anything like that you could share? Any recommendations, either off the back of this or just that you've enjoyed?
We've been watching Shogun,
yes.
which is amazing. Production value is just insane. It's so beautifully made. I've never read the books or anything, but I know that they're wildly popular. But yeah, that's been really interesting. I think it's really well cast, but it's just stunning how well made it is.
That was a book that was, every time I'd go around to an older male family member's house, that book was always on the shelf, and I never took it off. But it was like, it's a big book. And I was like, what's that? And then I had the Amstrad 464 cassette game back in the day when it used to take, you put the cassette in and it would take 45 minutes to load up. and then you'd navigate John Blackthorne through various bits. But yeah, it's fantastic, that show, isn't
That's
it?
cool. Yeah, it's really good. And then we started watching the Fallout series yesterday.
Oh yeah,
which
what's
has been
that
a lot
like?
more. It's a lot more fun than I thought it would be, to be honest, because I thought it looked terrible. Everyone on Twitter was going mental that there's a complete lack of like blocking and stuff. Which, I mean, I guess that was an interesting conversation because, yeah, the problem is that everybody wants to be a director or an actor, but what we actually need is, gaffers and things like that. And there's lots of problems with lighting and sound in a lot of modern film and TV shows because, people either aren't trained properly or there's a lack of them or nobody wants to do it and they think they can save money by getting a person to do 3 jobs. So a lot of these TV shows have got terrible blocking and lighting and sound mixing. But I think it's actually quite decent. It's a lot more fun than I thought it was. So yeah, we're about halfway through that at the moment. So yeah, it's better than I thought it would be. Books. What am I reading at the moment? I'm reading The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez. So she is an author. She's got two short story collections. I think she's got a novel out now as well. I think she's Brazilian off the top of my head. And she writes sort of short horror stories, a lot of which are set in and around Brazil. So the belief systems are really interesting. There's sort of aspects of Brazilian witchcraft, folk horror, mythology, hauntings, things like that. But they're all modern, but they're really, really well written. I've read both of her collections now, and I've really enjoyed them. I think she won the International Booker or Pulitzer, I think, for one of them. But yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the cover, and I recognise the cover. This looks fantastic.
Yeah, there's two collections: Things We Lost in the Fire and The Dangers of Smoking in Bed. And I think she has a novel now as well. But yeah, really, really good writer if you like horror, because I find horror very difficult to read sometimes because the writing can be pretty awful. I tend to stick to kind of classics like Shirley Jackson and things like that. But in terms of modern horror, Mariana Enriquez is probably my favourite at the moment.
Believe Me is written and edited by me, Chris Boyd, with production support from Steve Marshall. The music is by Johnny Boyle, and our logo is by Russ Brown. If you like the show, please do hit subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you out there next time.